the good, the bad, and the ugly. That pretty much summarizes my experience in the cannabis industry over the last 5 years. There's definitely been some good, there's definitely been some bad, and there's definitely been some ugly. But I think ugly we'll save that for another time, or maybe over a beer later. But I've been with Clever Leaves for more than 5 years. I've been in global business development roles. So really what that means is, because the term business development can mean a million things. Effectively what it means is my responsibility is open up new markets for our company. So we manufacture and cultivate in Colombia. That's where we're based. So we have extracts and flower. And my job is to bring that medical cannabis to customers, patients, pharmacies around the world. We've currently shipped medical cannabis to almost 20 different countries. And I've learned, I'd say, a few things over my 5 years in the industry. Medical cannabis is hard. It's definitely hard. It requires patience and persistence. And I'd say those are two words that sometimes don't go together. But from my experience, I've sort of always lived by that mantra, is that you have to be patient because things take time, but you also have to be persistent, which means you also have to make things happen. You can't just wait for it to happen. If you wait, then you won't be doing much. You won't make a lot of progress. You've got to push the envelope. You've got to have a plan A. And if plan A doesn't work, you've got to go to plan B. And if plan B doesn't work, you got to figure out what plan C is. And I won't go through the whole alphabet. That'll take up the whole time I have. But the other things I've learned are nothing ever happens as fast as you want it to. And the opportunities are never as big as people tell you they are. So that's sort of the underlying premise for my talk today. So really what I wanted to do was take you through, I'm a former consultant, so I don't want to say retired because you never know what happens, but I'm a pretty simple guy. I didn't want to overwhelm you with information, so I'm going to break it down to a very simple 3 questions for you to consider when you're looking to break into new markets. Number 1 is, what medical market should you enter and why? And I'll dig into each one of these. How will you attack that market, and can you win in that market? Now, the third one, I would argue, is the most important, but there's a reason it's third, because if you can't get in and you don't know how you're going to attack it, it doesn't matter whether or not you can win. Now, we could argue to say, well, if I can't win, then I shouldn't even bother with the first 2, but until you answer the first 2, you're not going to know whether or not you can win. That's the reason I put it. But I will also say that in my experience, the third question is the one that most companies forget. They might do a good job on the first, they might do a good job on the second, and then the assumption is we're going to bring product into the market and it's just going to sell itself, right? I think any of you that have been in any other industry in your entire lives realize that that never, ever happens. So the first question, let's put it in a step-by-step format, again, in my consulting words. You have to identify the potential markets you can enter. There's 2 components to this. One is on an opening side, is the market actually open, and the other is commercial. So the first is the market open? So yes, we could argue that every country has a medical market that's open if you look at it from a pharmaceutical pathway, right? You can always get pharmaceutical products in to a country following that pathway. From a true medical market standpoint, though, there's only a handful. And you don't really know whether or not it's open until you try. You can read the news. You can say, oh, Spain just announced that they're going to be doing something, and Germany's doing this, and Australia's doing that. But you really have to dig in before you really know the answer to that. My first role with Clever Leaves, going back more than 5 years, was head of business development for Canada, which for me was super exciting, being Canadian and living in Canada, saying, oh my gosh, I work for this amazing company. We can completely disrupt the medical market in Canada. We're going to import tons and tons and tons of product, and we're going to take over the Canadian market. Fast forward 6 months, you're laughing for those of you that may know about the Canadian market, right? And remember, this is all medical. I'm not even talking recreational, which is obviously a bigger piece of the pie. Fast forward 6 months, and I've now had numerous conversations with Health Canada, which is the regulator that regulates cannabis in Canada. I've got supply agreements set up with all the top companies in Canada to bring our product in. And I've now had serious conversations with Health Canada, who had put a regulation out that says you can import for scientific and medical purposes. That's the wording. Scientific and medical purposes. So what does that actually mean? That you can't import. That's what it means. So after 6 to 9 months of intense discussions, I don't want to go as far as to say lobbying, but really putting every possible argument that I could in front of Health Canada and trying to get import permits and bring product into the country, the answer was still always no. We never actually got an official rejection for an import permit application, but we also never got one approved. That's the way that Health Canada treats it from an import perspective. Is the regulations say you can do it, but then when you really get down to doing it, if you want to bring it in for research, that's fine. You want to bring in 5 grams and have them tested at a lab, you can do that. You want to bring in a bottle of oil, get it tested at a lab, you can do that. Anytime you try and do anything commercial. So that was my first lesson in the cannabis industry is what they say is not always what is actually happening, because the laws say we can bring it in. So then I was thinking to myself as I'm talking to my CEO and telling him that, Canada is effectively closed for us, thinking that I'd probably just talked myself out of a job as head of business development for Canada. But I had already started to look at other countries, and I said, Australia sounds interesting. Israel sounds interesting. Germany starts interesting. This is, 2018, 2019. These markets are starting to pick up. So then you have to start to look at, first question, do they allow imports? Yes or no? Canada and the US, obviously, for the most part, are off the table. So you start looking at other places. Is there a medical framework in place? What does that framework entail? Are you allowed to import? And then you answer those questions. Yes, there's a framework in place. Yes, I can import. The process seems fairly simple. I get an import permit from a customer in country A. I get an export permit from Colombia. We export the product and away we go. A month later, we have product in the country. Of course, a totally naive view for anyone in this space, because then you start to look at the individual countries and what the nuances are, right? So you'd say, okay, well, every country in the EU would have the same rules and regulations. Of course, that is absolutely untrue, okay? Which you all know. And then I say, well, okay, Israel, they smoke a lot of weed in Israel. There's lots of stuff going in there. Let's get into Israel. Okay, now you have to have specific rules on how you cultivate if you want to bring stuff into Israel. You have specific rules on how you have to do your post-harvest activities if you want to send flower to Israel. You have to have a new certification that effectively was created called IMC GAP for your growing. If you don't have that, you can't get in, okay? So again, that makes the attractiveness of this massive 20, 30, 50 ton market a whole lot more difficult to get into. So then you say, okay, Germany's big. Let's look at Germany. Okay, well, what are the nuances of Germany? Well, let's bring in irradiated flower, which we sell everywhere else in the world. Oh, AMRAD V. And another 9 to 12 months that I got to wait to bring flower into Germany. Okay, then I look at, Brazil. Brazil's big. Let's look at Brazil. Okay, well, you've got the compassionate use. You've got the RDC 327. You've got a 5-year program that's in now about year 2. And then I think, well, is there, then let's look at Australia. Australia, another big country. Well, not size-wise, but cannabis consumption-wise. Okay, well, we got into Germany, we got into Israel, so we can get into Australia. Well, no. Australia says if you're putting in extracts, you have to follow the TGO 93 requirements on the flower that goes into the extracts, right? So that's a different certification on your cultivation. So now you're looking at saying effectively for every country that you want to go into, you have to have different certifications, you have to follow different rules, and unfortunately, in some cases, those rules are conflicting. So literally, we have different pathways for our flower in Colombia. If it's going to Australia, it has to go this way. If it's going to Israel, it has to go this way. If it's going to Europe, it has to go this way, right? Not so much in how we grow it, but certainly in the post-harvest and the flower that we use for extraction, we actually have to determine at the beginning which country the extract is going to so we know which group of flower to use. So it isn't just as simple as, is the market open? And it certainly says, if you were successful in one market, that definitely does not give you the right to be successful in another market. And so we've learned that, we have a super regulatory team, a super QA team. I travel around the world to all different countries I can to learn how the market actually works. Because you can't learn it from reading reports. You can't learn it from talking to people over Zoom. You have to live it. You have to be in it. You have to really understand what the market is. I'm not even talking about meeting with the regulators. I'm just talking about the actual commercial aspect of bringing product in. Every country is a little bit different. How do you go directly to a pharmacy? Do you use a wholesaler? Can you go to patients? Everything is a little different, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the most important thing is that the way you have to assume this is no two countries are the same. And so I'm not going to say you're necessarily starting from scratch every time, but I think if you approach it that way, that's going to give you the most chance of success. And then the second part of, choosing which medical markets to enter is what is the real commercial opportunity, right? So we'll read reports, and I love the reports. I read all of them that come out. But anyone that tells me that country X is a $500 million medical cannabis market, it's completely untrue. Now, it might at some point, it might be if you include Sativex and Epidiolex and you're putting that into, cannabis medicines and things like that. But, getting a little romantic in here. Was it just me or the lights dim? Okay. It's you. No. But what you really have to understand from a commercial perspective is what is the true size of the market. So my advice to you is never target a market based on published value or size. You have to do your own research, and that's what we do. That's effectively what my job is. So you have to develop some criteria on how you're going to decide whether or not to enter a market. And part of that is you have to determine the actual size. So, just give you an example. We could probably say any number of countries fits this criteria or this example. But, you read in a report that it's a $500 million medical market. And you're like, oh, that's big. That's great. Like, even if we get, you start doing the math. If we get 1% of that, we get 10% of that. Like, what kind of market share do we want it? And then you start to realize that you're going about it completely the wrong way, because it's not a $500 million market. Because then you start to look at some of the other numbers and you say, okay, well, $500 million market, I'm not going to worry about how they got to that. I'm going to do my own calculation. Let's say there's 100,000 patients, or 100,000, not even worry about the number of patients. How many prescriptions are there? There's 100,000 prescriptions. Let's say the average value of a prescription is $150 a month. Okay? 100,000, $150 a month. So that $500 million market is now 18 million, right? I did the math, so you don't have to think about it, right? So now I'm taking this huge medical cannabis market that is going to make my company the biggest company in the world, and I've now taken it down to an $18 million market. Not nearly as sexy or attractive, right? That's also retail. That's the price that the patients pay. So unless you're going directly to patients, you now have to start stripping that number down even lower. So if I'm selling to a wholesaler, I got to take 30% of that off. If I'm selling to a customer who's selling to a wholesaler, I have to take another 30% of that off at least. That's being not generous with the margins. So now my $500 million market became an $18 million market, which is really now a $4 or $5 million market for what my company or a company can address. So at least now it's not as sexy, it's not as attractive, but now you know the real size. So now at least you're setting realistic expectations to say, even if we were to take a 50% market share based on where we're at, it's only going to be X addressable market size, right? Now, there's ways to improve on this, of course. I don't take it at face value, but those are the numbers that the way that my team and I calculate it when we're looking at new markets is I want to be able to know exactly what is really the addressable market. Now, we know that it's going to grow. We're going to do everything we can to help it grow, but I also want to be pragmatic and saying, it's not a $500 million market where we should be doing the math and saying if we get 10%, that's $50 million in revenue a year, because that's not available to us as a company in certain situations. So it's really, we use that term total addressable market. That's what we look at. We don't look at what's the market size. We don't look at what market share do we want. What's the total addressable market that we can achieve? And then we work on that, say, how do we then go about it? Which brings me to my second question, which is, how will you attack the market? So now you've determined that you can get in. You don't know exactly how you're going to do it, and it's probably going to take you 20 different tries to get in, but you know that you can get in somehow, some way. There's a plan A, B, C, D. Okay? You also know what the total addressable market size is. So you now have real information to develop a strategy, as opposed to saying, how do I approach a $500 million market? Now you're saying, I really have to be careful. How do I approach a $10 million, $15 million market? So how will you attack that market, right? And this comes down to, again, both a strategic and a regulatory question. From a strategic perspective, you have to look at how am I going to get in, right? Do I have a presence there? Do I have licensing there? Am I going to be a B2B company that sells directly to another company or a wholesaler who's then going to sell to a pharmacy. There's lots of different ways to get in, but am I going to go JV? Am I going to go B2B? Am I going to go B2C? Am I going to set up my own legal entity there, right? Am I going to partner with somebody and do a revenue share? I mean, there's lots of different options to do. I'm not here to tell you which is the best or the worst, because to be honest, we look at each market a little bit differently, and we do have different strategies for different markets. So as an example, here in Germany, we have a Clever Leaves Germany. We have a legal entity here. We have wholesale distribution licenses. We have narcotics licenses. We have import licenses. So the flower that we sell in Germany is actually, we sell directly to pharmacies. In most other countries, or at least the ones that we're in now, it's more of a B2B relationship where we do a lot of the manufacturing and we send it to a customer in that market, and they do all the distribution and the sales. So, and we're looking at different options depending on the country as well, as we look to explore new markets. But I think you have to understand, how are you going to win in that market, and what strategy are you going to take? So we know you can't advertise. So are you going to go after patients and try and convince it that way? Are you going to try and go door to door to pharmacies and try and convince them that way? Are you going to look to partner with, the biggest company in the market and try and gain market share that way? There's a lot of different ways that you can think about it. My experience is finding the right partner makes all of the difference in the world. And I know that sounds like an obvious statement, but when I first started in this industry, it was almost like whoever came to the table first was the right partner, right? And now we've learned our lesson, which is you have to be strategic about your partnerships. You have to find the right partners. You have to, literally, figuratively, get in bed with the right partners to find out how we're going to grow. I agree with everything that a bunch of different speakers have said today, which is about this industry is A, in its infancy, B, is rather small. So the idea of competing against each other, in my mind, doesn't make any sense right now. This market is not big enough. Like, if you want to, go to the UK and fight over 10,000 patients, that's fine. It doesn't make sense to me. What we should be talking about is, how do we make that 10,000 patients 110,000 patients, 200,000 patients, right? Then, thank you, Sita. But that's the way you have to approach it, because otherwise, like, I can't even tell you how long it's going to take for this industry to really blow up, right? We see it on small scale, we see it in pieces, we see it in different geographies, but we're still at the very beginning of it. Like, this is a marathon, and we're at the very beginning of it. I still, I would have said when I started, we weren't even at the start line yet. I think now, like, if it was a 100-meter race, we're like at meter 5. Like, literally, there's so much to be done in this industry. So, not to say that we don't worry about competitors or products and things like that, but I spend a lot more time trying to figure out, how are we going to set ourselves up for success in these markets? Who are we going to partner with? How are we going to partner with them? How do we make it worthwhile for both companies or multiple companies, so that all of us are going to win? Sorry, this thing keeps falling off my head. There we go, in the ears. So that we can all win, and that at the end of the day, I'm a commercial guy. I like to make money. I like to make money for my company. But at the end of the day, it's about the patients. And that's what we're really trying to achieve, is how do we get this wonderful medicine that people are benefiting from, how do we get it to the most patients in the most effective and affordable way? So that's the strategic element of it. The other part is then regulatory, right? Which is the pathway. So we make the assumption that there's a framework in place. You don't get to the second question if you can't answer the first question, right? So we now assume that there's a framework in place. There's some way that we can get product in. Okay, so now what are the requirements that you have to have? And again, going back to what I said earlier about the frameworks and how everything's different, for the most part, I'd say the EU, for the overall, as a non-EU resident looking in, relatively similar, but definitely not the same. Because then you start to get into the details of, what are the requirements for the products? What are the specifications for the products? How do you get a product in? Have others brought product in? What does the regulators need to see? Do I need to be audited? Do I have to have a certification? All of these things. And so the thing that I always look at is to say, you have to start from the bottom and work your way up. And you can't assume that just because you meet the requirements of country A, even if it's in Europe, that you can do country B. Now, let's assume that your requirements and your product specifications all meet, right? Now you have to deal with, how do I actually get product launched in that country? I've determined that I can get in. I've figured out how I'm going to get in. I've got the right partnerships. I've figured out that my product meets the specifications and the European pharmacopoeia or whatever it might be, all of those things. So now how do I actually get this product that's sitting in Colombia into Portugal, Greece, wherever it's going to be, Germany? And that's when the real nuance and the difficulty comes in, because, okay, great. We've launched extracts in Germany. That's fantastic. That doesn't do anything for us to be able to launch products in, let's say, Poland. Okay? Poland says you need a full dossier. It takes, you need a full product registration, and it's going to take 9 to 12 months for that product to get approved, assuming your documentation is right. Okay? So when I start to look forward, and this is where the persistence and the patience comes in, is because I start to look forward and I say, okay, so if I apply for a product registration in Poland, I'm a year away from actually getting product in there. But crap, there's a whole bunch of documentation that we have to put together in order to even submit that application. So now I look and I do a gap analysis and say, okay, we have some documentation, we have stuff that's ready for Europe, but that's not enough. It's not a full Module 3 CTT dossier, which I'm not an expert in. That's the extent of what I know about dossiers. But what I do know is they take a long time to put together, and they take really smart people to put them together. So now as a commercial guy, I'm looking at this going, it's going to take us 3 to 6 months to get the documentation ready to even apply for a product registration. And then it's going to take 9 to 12 months to get the product registration. And then maybe it's another 3 months, let's say, to get the first shipment in. So if I'm lucky and I start tomorrow, my first shipment, commercial shipment to Poland, if I'm lucky, is December 2024, right? More likely Q1 2025. So, explain that to your CEO, explain that to your investors, right? But that's the reality of this market. And I think that's the mistake that a lot of companies make, that I see in my experience just talking to companies, is you have to be pragmatic about it. You have to be realistic about it. We get calls almost daily, between emails and calls, from companies around the world, not German companies, but companies around the world that want to bring flower to Germany. Everybody wants to bring flower here, by the way, guys. Everybody loves bringing flower to Germany because they have no idea what that actually means. So, I'll get an email, I'll get a call. Yeah, we want to look at a couple of your strains. We want to bring them to Germany. And I'm like, okay, great. 4 or 5 years ago, I would get super excited about that, right? Now I'm smarter or more cynical. I'm not sure which one. I'll give it a little bit of A and a little bit of B, right? And so now but let's say the smarter side of me starts to ask them questions. Does your what kind of flower is it? How are you growing it? What kind of certifications do you have? Does it meet these requirements? And like by the 4th question, I see them on Zoom and their faces are just like, ugh. Like, no, we don't meet that. Oh, what's a narcotics license? Oh, what's AMRAD FAO? Oh, so like I don't do it to scare people. I do it because if they're not ready and they don't understand those things, there's nothing we can do about that. Like, so do you have a license? How are you going to get it in? What's your partnership set up? It's like, no. We what's your timeline? Oh, we want to get it in by next month. Right? Okay. I think this conversation is over. Right? But you also have to get smart when you start to have those conversations to say, like, there's a series of questions that I will literally ask on the first or second call I have with any partner that we're discussing with. And that's really how I qualify them. If we can't get past that first set of questions, it'll be, great talking to you. Let's stay in touch. One of those kinds of things, right? But you can't spend time on those things, because if you know more than they do and you know whether it's not going to work, that's where I've learned is you have to sort of cut ties, or you just keep in touch a little bit, but you got to push ahead with what you know is going to work. And then, so let's assume by now you figured out that you can get into the market, you know what the realistic size is, you've developed your strategy, you know your product meets the requirements, you can get it in, okay? So, can I win? Because I've got a 20-to-1 extract, and there's 3 other 20-to-1 extracts in the market, right? And you brought this point up this morning, right? Am I just another product that's similar to what's already there? And so this is the question, like I said at the very beginning, that I think a lot of companies forget to ask themselves. Again, going on the assumption that, well, it's medical cannabis, like we've got the pathway, we'll bring it in and it'll sell itself. And being completely honest in front of a public group, I was that naive person 4 years ago. You'll bring it in and people will buy it because you don't understand the pathway and you don't understand how this actually works. And then you start to get used to it and say, okay, well, yes, it's a prescription drug. So, oh yeah, if I think about it, that means somebody actually has to prescribe it in order for a patient to get it. So now I have to start thinking a lot differently about how am I going to win, because how am I going to get a prescriber that I don't know, that as our company, we don't touch, we don't speak to, how am I going to get them to prescribe my product over somebody else's, right? And so that's where you really have to have, and we can call it value proposition, unique selling proposition. There's a million different names that we can call it. I'll call it none of those, except this is your strategy on how to win, which is you have to determine what your angle is. And again, it's not from a marketing perspective, but you have to decide, am I going to be going in with an aggressive pricing strategy, so I'm going to go in low cost? Am I going to go in with super high premium product that nobody else has? Am I going in with a copycat and I'm just going to cut the price in half? Am I developing formulations that don't exist in the market? Am I doing research with our partners in market to find out what's their demand for that there's no supply right now? Who are the companies that are selling the most and what are they selling? And are they ever out of stock? So this is really, again, understanding that market intimately to really be able to say, this is how we're going to attack the market because we have a right to win there, right? So this is a question, this is my CEO, Andres, loves to say the term right to win. That's something that comes up in every single executive conversation we have, which is what's our right to win, right? We talk about, the CBD market, which there's been a bunch of conversations about that, CBD flower to Switzerland or Italy or wherever it might be. What's our right to win? Do we have a right to win there? Probably not. Looking at the CBD extract market in the US, do we as Clever Leaves have a right to win in that market? Competing against all these outdoor growers in the US that can do it for 1 cent and then they extract it in a garage and put it into the gas station. I mean, literally, can we compete against that as a pharmaceutical company with EU GMP certification? Not our market, right? So those are decisions you have to make. So it's not just about pursuing every single opportunity that's out there. Sometimes the best decision is saying no, right? And again, somebody said it before, maybe it was you, Anna, it's a decision. May not be the right or the wrong decision, but it's a decision. And that strategy is all about choices. And that's what you have to make. So when you're talking about how are we going to win, you have to look at, again, what are the strengths of your company? What do you do well? Are you good at talking to patients? Are you, do you have the right people in market, in-house to be able to talk to patient groups, talk to pharmacies, talk to prescribers, right? You have to understand where that strength comes from. I could say for our strength is that we have really high quality pharma grade products coming from a low cost country. As simple as that. That may not be exactly what's in all of our investor decks and our public, but to me, that is what we have. We have we have 3 different EU GMP certifications. We have, hopefully about to get Australian GMP. We have Colombian GMP. We have Brazilian GMP, right? So we're going for the record for the most GMP certifications of any cannabis company in the history of the world. And I think we'll get there. We're now at 5. But the reason is, that's not to brag about our company. The reason is that's what is required for us to be able to go into these markets and stay there, right? Because the other thing that you always have to remember is that those regulations change, right? So great, I'm not doing anything, right? I don't even have the thing in my hand. Okay, well, the slide hasn't changed. So for 20 minutes, if you haven't memorized it by now, then you can send it out. There you go. And you'll see my next one's even more complicated. So I think that's really the important thing too, is not only you have to do the work at the beginning to make sure you get in, but then you have to continue to do the work, right? A clear example of this is, for those of you that know or are dealing with Australia, about a year ago, Australia came out and said, come July 1st, 2023, effectively products have to be GMP or GMP equivalent. Before that, it didn't have to be. So as of July 1st of this year, products have to be GMP, which changes a lot, right? Doesn't change, thankfully for us, because we were GMP in the first place. But you still have to get recognition from the TGA, which is the authority in Australia. So it's not just good enough that you have EU GMP certification. It has to be EU GMP certification that is signed off by the TGA formally. Not just, yeah, now you're good, but like a letter that says you're good, right? Then you're good to go. So what we're seeing is that that's knocking out about half of the suppliers that supply to Australia right now because they're not GMP, they can't meet the requirements. And so, I mean, it's good for us, but it also shows how these things don't last forever. And so you have to stay on top of them on a consistent basis, or you're going to find yourself, we always used to joke about Israel because literally there was a period of time, I think early last year, where almost every week the Israeli regulations were changing. They were just adding little things here and there. They're little nuances, but they almost made you have to rejig your cultivation or rethink your strategy. Like every week for about 2 months was like, I'd wake up and I was like, what's Israel going to put out now? Right? And that was sort of the joke for literally about 2 months every morning. What's your car going to say now? So you have to stay on top of it because you may wake up one day and everything that you've done for the last 2 years, I'm not going to say has been undone, but has now been changed. And so you have to think about that. So a little bit more detail on this one, but this is what you need to do in my mind. If you're really looking at growing your business outside of whatever your home country is, that you want to break into other markets, the first is you got to perform a detailed regulatory and commercial analysis. So we do this country by country. We don't do it for Europe. We don't do it for South America. We do it literally country by country. It is time consuming. It is not the most fun work to do, but once you've got it, you have that information, and we've developed our own proprietary tools and things like that. But it's a big analysis on the market. Can we get in? What's the real commercial opportunity? Then you have to do your strategy that gives you the best chance for success. So this is how are you going to partner? Who are you going to partner with? Are you going to go directly to patients, pharmacies, prescribers, things like that? And then the last one is, again, the most important in my mind, but the one that most forget, is the clear vision on how you're going to differentiate yourself, either products or services. And again, I'm talking about medical cannabis products, but this would apply for services as well, because you have to be able to differentiate yourself. Sorry, I don't know why that's so hard for a native English speaker. You have to be able to differentiate yourself so that you really have that, as my CEO would say, that right to win. Thank you very much.